Today, I'm going to share with you a few ways in which you can help your yoga students optimize the benefits of pigeon pose. Now, pigeon pose is a very popular pose, and it is likely that you have sequenced it in your classes at least a couple of times. Now, although this pose is very popular and it's really commonly taught, it's actually a pose that does generally use a lot of force to create flexibility. Now, when we encourage our students to use force and resort to using force to create flexibility, this actually does limit the lifespan of their practice, because we run the risk of destabilizing the joints by overstretching the tendons and the ligaments. Now, if you want to help your students develop a more sustainable approach to pigeon pose and also make this pose more accessible at the same time, well, I'm going to show you a few ways that you can do that. 3 ways specifically that you can prepare your students' bodies by activating the opposing areas that pigeon pose generally targets, activating those areas in order to reciprocally release those target areas. So let me explain what I mean by that. Now, when we look at pigeon pose, we've got that one leg in front and we've got the opposite leg stretching behind. Now, obviously, depending on if the body is up versus if the body is down and forward, the target area is going to change. So what we're going to look at is if the body is up, because that is the initial phase and the initial position that most people are going to go in before they come and lie the body down anyway. So that's the one that we're going to work with. Now, when that leg is forward, we've got target area of this glute here. And what do most people do? They try to press and draw that shin further towards the top of the mat, thinking that it's going to get into this target area more. However, as I mentioned earlier, that approach is very forceful on the body. And what it ends up doing is actually creating destabilization of the joints because of how much it overly lengthens the tendons and the ligaments. So this is not actually a very sustainable approach to pigeon pose in general. So that's why I like to give these preparatory methods and these exercises to help my students' bodies open and invite the stretch in rather than just constantly resorting to force. So let's get back to that front leg again. We've got this target area of the glute. Now, instead of just trying to shove that shin forward and trying to get deeper into this, we utilize the body's natural communication system, which generates natural flexibility. This is called reciprocal inhibition, where this area that is being targeted to be lengthened and stretched, it actually will naturally lengthen when the opposing area, the opposing muscle, contracts, engages, and activates. And that's what we're going to focus on. I'm going to show you 3 ways that you can do that in your sequence: from a standing, from a down dog, and also lying down. Now, we've got the back leg. That's just the front leg. Now, with the back leg, we have got this big hip flexor stretch, yeah? Obviously, we've got all this stuff happening through the belly, and just depending on what kind of variation of pigeon your students are doing or you are teaching, then sometimes there'll be a lot more of that and an emphasis on the back bend than perhaps if the student is lying down and the line from the head to the foot is pretty flat, versus when the body is upright, the chest is lifted and the leg is out, and then you've got quite a big back bend going on there. So that's a lot of lengthening into the hip flexor. Now, instead of just forcing that and lifting the body up, we're going to utilize reciprocal inhibition. Now, what is the opposing area to this? It's this. So we're going to be using the strength of the hamstring and the glute to reciprocally, naturally invite release into the front of the leg that is extended back. And again, I'm going to show you how to incorporate the front leg preparation and the back leg preparation in 3 different ways: standing, from down dog, and also lying down. So let's get started. So from a standing position, all you need to do is instruct your students to create some type of movement that activates this inner thigh in an externally rotated position to target the natural release of this outer hip. This activation reciprocally releases that target area that we are focused on generally in a pigeon pose. And it tells it activates and it tells it, hey, I'm trying to do a job here. Can you guys there relax, soften, and let go? So this is an invitational way to prepare your students for the forceful nature of pigeon pose. So all you would need to do in a standing sequence is incorporate some type of movement that involves external rotation plus a crossing over of the midline. And you can just try this, yeah? Because if you lift up here and you don't cross the midline, but you still got external rotation, then this activation is just not really present. Whereas as soon as you cross the midline, this leg doesn't have to be high, okay? Just crossing the midline while maintaining external rotation, this activates, which reciprocally releases through here, helping to encourage that area of the body, inviting it to open in preparation for that leg being forward in a pigeon pose. I, as an example, like to incorporate this before something like an eagle pose, or I just make it a stand-alone balance on its own. And I'm going to give you one little tip for that in one moment. So if you're incorporating it into eagle pose, the leg can lift. You can start with external rotation first, or the leg can lift, then you move to external rotation, then you can cross the midline. So if you're incorporating this into eagle pose, whatever's happening with the arms, we're not going to focus on that right now, you would keep squeezing, pressing the sole of the foot over to this side, and then you would sit down and you keep squeezing and crossing and encouraging that activation that is naturally occurring to squeeze and cross the midline before you wrap around. Now this video is not about eagle. However, that preparation that I just showed you is also a very invitational, harmonious, natural, loving way to invite that hip, outer hip to open as the leg wraps up and around for eagle pose. So that is one way. Now I do like to incorporate this sometimes just as a standalone balance. And a little tip that I want to show you is as the leg crosses over, you can also add some sort of twist. And why do we do this? The twist encourages the activation of the inner thigh to maintain the press across the midline. Because we don't want to have the leg come with the body. Yeah? The leg stays crossing and the upper body turns in the opposite direction, which means this has to activate, naturally has to engage to hold that crossing. So there's one way when you're standing. Now a second way for the back leg. Yeah, we've got that extension in pigeon pose for the back leg. Now you can incorporate this type of movement into like every sun salutation that you teach. So instead of just having the regular old cue to reach up and then to forward fold or whatever it is that you're cueing, you can kick the heel to the bum. Now when you kick the heel to the bum, what this does is it utilizes hamstring strength and glute strength, which reciprocally releases up through the front of that leg, kicking back. Now as you can see, I have my knee bent, and then maybe you can drop it down to a forward fold. You can also keep that leg straight, and you would just cue, kick back. Maybe even this is the back bend on the sun salute. Exhale, forward fold. And then you would want to do that for both legs, just depending on your sequence and depending on what's following that with pigeon pose. Now I'm going to show you how you can do this from a downward facing dog for your students. So remember, we're focusing on one leg extending behind the body and the opposite leg drawing in front of the body. That's the way the legs are going in pigeon pose. So if you have the right leg forward and the left leg back in pigeon pose, you're going to cue to sweep the left leg back and up, and you'll come into some little pulses here, keeping the length through the back of that knee. Now these can be straight-legged pulses, or you can cue some donkey kicks, pressing the sole of the foot up towards the ceiling. I like to give the visualization of, imagine you have paint on the sole of your foot and you're trying to make a footprint up on the ceiling. So you'd cue that, you'd lengthen that leg, drop it down. With the opposite leg, you would draw the knee into the chest, and you can do this with the back knee up or drop it down. The foot is going to slide through, and you're going to tap pinky toe, tap outside of the leg. Pinky toe, outside of the leg. Now this is just one option. Another option is, like we did similar in the standing balance work, we just slide, press, and slide across the midline. Now you can notice that now my toe is dragging on the ground. You can also cue your students to have it lifted and squeeze and hover across, so that by the time your students are going into pigeon pose, they've invited opening into this front outer hip because they've activated this inner thigh. They've invited opening into this front hip flexor and thigh because they've activated this hamstring and this glute. And the third way that you can sequence this in your classes is by lying down on the back and crossing one leg again over the midline. So let's just say we're working on the left inner thigh to release the left outer hip. We've got the external rotation, and then we've got this squeeze across the midline, that squeeze. And in this instance, you might even find this is actually a really great variation or modification for some of your students to take, and they might find this actually holds a lot more value than doing the pigeon pose itself. And remember that you can play around with these things. So you might have that squeeze across, and maybe the arms go out, and then maybe the leg goes out to the side. So what we're doing is we're really emphasizing the mobility of the hip rather than just using force to create flexibility, which is what pigeon is generally doing. So again, it's that squeeze and that activation of the inner thigh that will naturally occur when we intentionally externally rotate, coupled with crossing the midline. But again, you might like to have a little bit of oscillation between moving to the out and moving in, and you might even like to oscillate between some sort of internal rotation and some sort of external rotation crossing over at the midline. And when it comes to a lying down position, to activate the glute and the hamstring to reciprocally release the quad and the hip flexor for the back leg in a pigeon pose, you can work on, just like we did from the standing, either straight leg as the leg lifts, or you can work on some sort of donkey kicks, pressing the sole of the foot up towards the ceiling. Now, just depending on your sequence, your students, you can offer this coupled with some sort of backward bend. Maybe there's a little lift up of the chest as the leg presses up. Maybe you even draw the arms in somewhat as the leg lifts up. But in all those instances, the activation of that back glute and of that back hamstring, it will reciprocally release through the front of the hip, the opposing muscle, which means that your body, your students' bodies, will be much happier to accept maybe a little bit of force through the forceful nature, the stretch of pigeon pose that we're generally intending to create. And therefore, this creates a lot more of a sustainable approach to their practice, and it improves the accessibility of this pose for your students. I have found it to be so important to start to view hip opening not just through the lens of flexibility when I teach yoga, but through the lens of mobility, particularly if we really want to give the credit to the claim that yoga promotes longevity. If we're continuously teaching our students to force their flexibility and run the risk of destabilizing the joints by overstretching the tendons and the ligaments, while we're not really delivering on the idea that yoga promotes longevity. So try these things in your classes, these little exercises. Again, this is a technique that is called reciprocal inhibition. This is a natural mechanism in the body, a natural reflex, and this is how we can invite our students into poses like pigeon pose without constantly having them rely on force and without having to heavily enforce and promote the use of force and pushing the body into a particular position. So if you like this video, please let me know in the comments, give it a like, and if you want to see more like this, subscribe to my channel.